Um, so our speaker for today is Rebecca Walwyn, and Rebecca is Associate Professor of Clinical Trials Methodology and LICTA. So following a background in psychology, Rebecca's PhD was in treatment-related clustering or therapist effects. So specifically that was in psychotherapy, but her interests include design and analysis of cluster randomized trials, Factorial trials, complex intervention trials, and other novel experimental designs.
I'm going to tell you a bit of a story because I started this journey as a trial statistician with the views of trial statisticians around this, and I have changed my mind, and I would quite like in the course of today to change your minds as well, and that's the general idea. So from my purpose really in terms of factorial experimental designs is in optimising complex interventions, and that's what I'm going to talk about today. So complex interventions are defined as interventions that contain several potentially interacting components. That said, when we do a trial, we tend to regard it as one treatment variable with either package A or package B, and much the same way as you would do any drug trial, all you know about is what is in the case in that black box of a complex intervention. As a result of that, there have been 50 years worth of trials in this area, and what we really only know about is the effect of one intervention package versus another intervention package. We don't really understand, other than qualitatively and observationally, we don't understand the effects of the individual components and how those interact with one another. So from my point of view, I'm very interested in the idea of unpacking a complex intervention and understanding how it works, as well as whether it works as a package as a whole. And roughly at the point where I was thinking about this, as always happens with me, I discovered that somebody else is also thinking about it at the same time. So Linda Collins in America was in the process of saying, well, there is this design of experiments literature that exists that tells you how to optimize a complex intervention, and we're not using it in the clinical trials community. So she basically said that we should be using factorial designs as they were meant for originally, and for this purpose that I'm talking about. The problem with this is that within the clinical trials community, there is an assumption that you don't use a factorial design if there is any raw, plausible interaction between the components of that complex intervention, which completely goes against the definition of a complex intervention and makes you think that factorial designs are therefore not sensible for using when you're optimizing a complex intervention, and that's what I'm going to talk about a bit today. So you might fall on one side of this coin. I'm hoping you're all going to fall on the same side of it by the end of today. So Linda Collins introduced something called the multi-phase optimization strategy, which is basically a fancy way of saying let's do what the design of experiments people have been doing for years. And the general idea there is that you include a preparation phase, which is a bit like our pilot and feasibility stage, where you're sort of doing the work that sort of prepares you for it. Once you've decided as part of your preparation phase how you're going to on what criteria you're going to optimize your complex intervention, the next stage is to do the optimization stage, and that is split into two. The first is a screening experiment where you're trying to identify components of a complex intervention that are important to take forwards, and then there's a refinement stage, which is when you are basically taking forward the ones that look promising and trying to work out the optimal combination of those and the different levels of those particular components. And the idea from Linda's point of view is that you then go on and do a straightforward parallel group trial design as an evaluation thing, where you are not necessarily doing it in an explanatory way, you're doing it in a more pragmatic way, and you are then doing a head-to-head comparison between your empirically optimized intervention versus standard practice, and that would be the end. So I started thinking about all of this in relation to the AFFINITIE programme, and all you need to know about it for the purposes of today is that it is about audit and feedback as an intervention to improve evidence-based use of blood transfusions in the NHS as a whole. It's a programme that's been ongoing for several years, and we are getting to the analysis point at this stage now. So in terms of this intervention, it came from control theory, which is a psychological theory on how you change behaviour. It also came from a Cochrane review that basically told us that audit and feedback works as an intervention compared to not having audit and feedback, but what we don't know is what version of audit and feedback we need to do. So we need to know how to optimise the version of audit and feedback we give in terms of that. So to keep life simple at this stage, because this was the first trial of this type that was done in the area, we had two interventions, and we focused on optimising the feedback part of audit and feedback, with the audit part being our data collection for the trial. So we had a baseline audit that we fed back on, and then we had a follow-up audit, which was our outcome data that we also fed it back on. And so our two interventions were enhancing the audit reports, or the content of the feedback that was given, in which case what was delivered to the hospitals, but the other part was to enhance what follow-on support was given to the hospitals in terms of a toolkit, etc., so that they were to make use of the feedback they were given and put it into action plans and make it actually have an effect on it. So we separated out what was an intervention package into two components, the enhanced content and the enhanced follow-on support versus, in each case, a standard content and a standard follow-on support. So the aim of the trial, the programme, was to evaluate feedback interventions embedded within a national clinical audit. So we were doing this at scale, we were doing this across the whole country, and therefore it's relatively large in terms of size. There were two of these trials in two different audit topics, but I'm only going to concentrate on one at a time today. We were talking about 135 NHS trusts across the country and about 2,000 patients, and our primary outcome was whether a patient received an unnecessary blood transfusion or not. So in terms of where we saw this, you end up with a 2x2 factorial design with your experiment, and we were expecting around 20% of the transfusions to be unnecessary in the usual group. We were hoping that enhancing the feedback content would reduce that to 14%. We were hoping that enhancing the follow-on support would also reduce it back to 14%. And the bit that became an issue for discussion was what would happen if we enhanced both the content and the follow-on support. Now, if it was to assume no interaction, then that number would be 8%, because it would add up in the same way. So you'd have a 6% difference there and a 6% difference here, a 6% difference here and a 6% difference here, if that makes sense. And therefore you would be basically, your components have the same impact whether they're with something else or without something else. Now, these effects within the table are known as simple effects, and that's probably what we concentrate in the clinical trials community on, is these within the table effects. But actually what we're probably more interested in is these marginal effects along the side, where basically in the presence of an interaction, and this is an interaction because it's not equal to 8%, so the fact that we're basically saying that there's going to be a ceiling effect on the amount of change that we can have. So yes, we can possibly have 6% effect on the proportion of unnecessary transfusions with each intervention at a time, but if you put them together, we're not going to have as much as double the effect. We're going to have slightly less than that, so there's this ceiling effect. So we had a discussion and we decided that plausibly that this value would be somewhere between 8 and 12%, which is a small antagonistic interaction. And that means that the general way that we do sample size calculations for factorial trials, which is to assume no interaction, wasn't necessarily the reasonable thing to do. So what we in effect ended up doing was a sample size calculation on this marginal effect, where this is the average of usual follow-on support across the content, and this is the average of the enhanced follow-on support across the content, etc. And we don't tend to think in terms of these marginal effects. When we're doing factorial trials in clinical trials, we tend to be thinking in terms of the other ones. So I'm going to carry on. The sample size calculation that we did was a sort of hybrid, and the way it was worded was a bit of a hybrid between how we normally do it and how I would now do it now. We had two principal comparisons of interest, and we were basically interested in the main effects. So we had our assumption of 20% unnecessary transfusions. Because of the literature that was available within the clinical trials community at the time, I versed this as a 6% difference, which was in the presence of a small antagonistic interaction, as opposed to a 5% marginal effect, which is actually equivalent to what I'm saying here. And I was interested in 80% power and a two-sided significance level, and that meant that I needed a sample size of about 152 clusters. We didn't get 152, but that's what we wanted, and 45 in terms of our cluster size. So at the time, I was aware of a paper that existed within the clinical trials community that basically gave the power of detecting main effects in the presence of realistic interactions. And if you look at that, it's got this lovely formula that looks really complicated, and you think to yourself, well, that must be complicated. And actually, it isn't complicated at all, because all it's doing is turning what we think of in terms of the way that clinical trialists think about this into the same language that you would use if you were a design of experiments person. And actually, I personally find it much easier to think in terms of having to work out what those marginal effects are and do a sample size calculation of any type that I normally do, but on those marginal effects as opposed to those simple effects. So the nice thing that it does, though, is give you the ability to give a nice sort of sensitivity analysis around what you're doing. So on the basis of the 130 clusters, which we thought was likely to be our worst case scenario, and given that we got 135, that wasn't too bad, this is what the power curves look like. So it was all, we framed it in terms of what that, the proportion of unnecessary transfusions were in the enhanced group, and if it was equal to 8%, there was no interaction, and that would mean, if there was no interaction, it would mean that we basically had very small power for the interaction because there wasn't one, and there would be 90% power for the main effects. Now, the main effects power does rather drastically reduce as you increase the size of the interaction, and the power for detecting the interaction at the same time goes up. So you're sort of replacing the ability to detect a main effect by the ability to detect an interaction, which to me is a perfectly reasonable thing to want to do, and I think that's fine. But what we said was that we were roughly in the middle of these two lines, and that we felt that 80% power to detect our marginal effect of 5% was reasonable in this sort of case. So the other part of this was also on the lines of cross between what is standard within clinical trials and what probably shouldn't be. And the first part is that there is a discussion about how you analyse a factorial trial. So in my mind, you include an intercept term, you have a main effect for the first component, a main effect for the second component, and then an interaction for the two, and then an error term. So it's relatively straightforward, that's roughly what you'd expect. You might put in some covariates for your design factors or something of that sort as well. Now, automatically in my mind, because that's what we do in clinical trials, I had used this dummy coding, where I coded my control within each factor as 0, and my intervention within each factor as 1. And that is the normal way that we do these things, and I'm changing my mind on that, but we'll come to it. What I did decide at this point was that it was nonsensical to do the normal analysis, which basically ignores the interaction, because you've assumed no interaction in the design, and therefore you exclude the interaction from the analysis in a clinical trial. To me that seemed unreasonable, because if I had no power to detect that interaction, but that interaction was sizable, then I would be biasing my main effects if I didn't include it in the model, when I assumed that it was non-zero. So from my point of view, that's where I was. I was thinking I needed to include my interaction in the model, and that's what I decided to do. So to give you a bit more of the context as to where I was coming from and why I was having an argument about these things rather than them being fairly obvious, roughly in the 1970s, Richard Peto came up with the idea that you use factorial clinical trials as a way of answering two independent questions for the price of one. So what he's basically doing is using one trial to answer the effects of two different treatments that could be used in combination, but actually you're more interested in the separate effects of each of those interventions than you are in the combined effect. And because you're assuming that those two interventions don't interact with one another, you are in effect getting the answers to two of those questions in one trial with one set of patients, rather than doing two trials and answering that question in two trials. So from that point of view, and that roughly was the way that the literature went. So the first randomised factorial trial was reported by Chalmers back in 1955, but the design wasn't really used within the clinical trials community until the 1970s and 80s, when it was used as a way of answering two independent questions for the price of one. As a result of that, they were interested in the simple effects, the effects within the table, and they were assuming that those were equal, and that therefore it didn't matter whether you were interested in the marginal effects or the simple effects, because they were equivalent. And as a result, they proposed something called a factorial analysis, which I squirm at, but I will use anyway, because that's what it's used in the literature as. Because to me it isn't a factorial analysis, because it has nothing to do with the factorial design literature. It is something that is very specific to clinical trials. And that analysis basically includes the main effect for factor A, the main effect for factor B, and nothing else in the model. And this is the way that most factorial trials are analysed. So, even fairly recently, so this is in press in that you can get it online, but it's dated next year, so presumably it isn't completely. And they do a very good job of summarising the sorts of claims that people make. So the idea is that when treatments interact, that a factorial trial can be misleading. That when the treatments are known to interact, you should do a multi-arm or inside the table analysis, and that is much more appropriate. So what you're in effect doing is treating your factorial trial as a four-arm trial and doing pairwise comparisons between each of the arms. And that is what we are taught is the way to do things, if you have the potential to have an interaction. They also say that when efficiency is the main aim, and I'm not sure it is just efficiency that the main aim is the main aim, but we'll sort of ignore that for the time being. It is generally recommended that factorial trials are undertaken only when no interaction is expected. And so as a result, I'm having quite definite problems trying to do factorial trials where I am expecting to find interactions, because this is the status quo, this is what everybody believes. And slightly worse is that I had a conversation with Brendan Kahn about a year or so ago about this, and I said to him, why can't you just include the interaction in the model? So he's now in his paper, and I hope it's not because of me, has decided that one of the potential pitfalls of an analysis of a factorial trial is including the interaction in the model, and that basically adjustment for the interaction term in the model when conducting a factorial trial, it is unclear what the rationale would be behind this approach. He thinks that the reason why one might want to do this is because you maintain your efficiency, so your sample size and your power is contained, but it's basically saying that that as a suggestion is completely flawed. So he also did a review of 100 trials recently published between 2015 and 2018, and he used those across the board. So previous reviews have been done within particular outcomes or clinical areas. This was a review across the board. And he identified 752 2x2 factorial clinical trials in general, and then reduced that down to a random sample of those between those 2 days. He found within his random sample of 100 trials that 78 of them didn't provide any rationale for why they'd chosen a factorial design, that only 63% of them assessed the interaction at all, and only 39 out of the 63 that presented that at all did so for a secondary outcome. So they were choosing to do this for the primary outcome, but not for any secondary outcomes. Similarly, 12 out of the 63 that looked for an interaction found one, and 16 out of the 39 that looked for an interaction of the secondary outcome found one. So it isn't rare that you can find a significant interaction in a factorial clinical trial. Whereas this is what we're led to believe, is that these sorts of interactions don't happen because we can assume them away. Slightly concerningly, 18 out of the 100 decided to use a factorial analysis or a within the table analysis on the basis of a preliminary test for the interaction. So they're testing for the interaction, and we know that the power for doing that is really quite low for anything that's reasonably small, and then they're deciding their analysis on that. I think there is a consensus that that is not an approach that you should take. And for my benefit, it's quite nice to know that I'm not the only one who thinks that including the interaction term in your factorial analysis is a good idea. So to me, there are these two divergent ways of thinking about it, and I kind of need to marry them up because I don't think I'm going to be able to convince anybody on a funding board to fund a factorial trial unless I do somehow get past this set of arguments. So to me, there are reasons why you would be doing something different, and I think the basic reason is that we're estimating different things. So Fisher is quite nice, I think, and this is the reason why I like factorial trials, because actually complex interventions aren't usually delivered in isolation of lots of other things that happen. So you might make a tweak as to one part of your complex intervention, and then in the world at large there will be variation in all of the different components that go alongside that tweak. And actually, to be able to know that your intervention has a certain effect averaged across all of the other ways that it could be provided as a package, I think is actually quite important. And I think that it is actually quite, whereas what I don't want to do is to isolate and control down all these other things that people are doing alongside and have a very controlled experiment where I'm just changing this one bit of it and keeping everything else constant. And the only way I can do that properly in my mind is to use a factorial design. It also allows me to test out dozens of different versions of my complex intervention in one go without having to do lots and lots and lots and lots of parallel group trial designs. So to me, I'm getting an awful lot out of doing a factorial trial that I wouldn't otherwise be able to do. I also think that the main effects, as they're traditionally thought of, are what we're interested in when we're optimising a complex intervention. And main effects are basically the difference between marginal means, which is what I'm thinking about. They're not what potentially we are naturally thinking about as clinical trialists. Because I think that what we're interested in as people doing two independent questions for the price of one is those within the table simple effects that you have within that case. And I think that that's why that these literatures are divergent, because some of us are trying to estimate one thing and the others of us are trying to estimate something else, and you do a different type of analysis and different sort of sample size calculation depending on what you're trying to estimate. So the simple effects are basically differences amongst particular cells within your factorial table, and you are in effect looking at the effect of one independent variable while within a level of another independent variable. So to put that in sort of terms that I sort of understand, is that in the red circle you are interested in what is the case when you fix usual to follow-on support to the usual version of it, and you want to know what the effect of usual content is versus enhanced content. And I think that that's what we tend to do naturally within clinical trials. We fix this and we vary this, and we're interested in this effect here. But I think that we should be interested in the effect of enhancing content, regardless of whether I'm doing it with usual follow-on support or enhanced follow-on support. And therefore that's what I'm doing here. And inherently, that is a 6% difference, and that is a 5% difference. So if I'm setting myself up to estimate these, and I'm estimating this instead, then I'm going to have a biased estimate of my 6%. So that's why the clinical trials community don't like factorial designs, is because they are inherently trying to estimate that 6%, but their analysis is estimating that one instead. And so it is perfectly reasonable that they can run simulations, they can do all sorts of things that are very convincing and tell you that actually that you can't use a factorial design, and I think the fundamental thing is that they're estimating the wrong thing. So the way that you go about in terms of the analysis, and there is a nice primer on factorial designs space for clinical trialists that's been published relatively recently, and it builds on something that wasn't peer-reviewed but has been published online, which talked about these things before. And so in an ANOVA context, then usually you are using what's known as effect coding, where basically your factors are either 0, -1, or they're +1. In regression, you have to decide how you code your treatment effects. You either code them, as I said, I naturally do because I'm a clinical trialist, as 0, 1 dummy variables, or you include them as -1, +1, and then use the effect coding version of them. And you have the choice to do either of those things. So I think that traditionally, within the clinical trials community, we use the dummy coding, whereas I think that we probably should be moving over to standardly using an effect coding, and I will explain why. Basically, you're estimating different things depending on which of those two options that you do. If you use the dummy coding, then your estimate of the 5% comes from an estimate of the within bit. If you're trying to estimate these marginal effects when you're doing everything within the table, then you have to estimate the main effect within the table and then work out what the difference is in terms of the interaction to be able to work out that. So to be able to get back to that 5% difference, you need to use both the main effect and the interaction effect to be able to estimate that overall effect, if that makes sense. And so as a result of that, the dummy coding is similar to the simple effects. It's using those things within the table, and the main effect, as I think of it, which is the marginal effect, is a weighted combination of both the main effect and the interaction effect. And because it is this weighted combination of both the main effect and the interaction effect, it means that you have to worry about the interaction to a greater degree than you do in any other situation. So that's one reason why that's not particularly good. And it's also, I think, the reason why Brendan Kahn talks about the idea that this doesn't actually save you any power, because he's assuming that I wanted to use a dummy coding, which I now don't. So if you're using the effect coding, you are directly estimating the main effect with your analysis. And it is averaged across the other factors, and it makes no reference whatsoever to the interaction effect. So the interaction effect becomes no part of your estimate of your main effect, and as a result of that, you don't really need to know what size the interaction effect is. It has no role whatsoever in your estimating of the main effect, which means that it has no effect whatsoever on your ability to detect your main effect, which means that we really ought to be able to do trials where we're interested in detecting main effects without worrying whatsoever about the presence of an interaction, as long as our marginal effects and the things that we're actually interested in detecting are based on something that is realistic in the presence of that interaction. So you are in effect answering a different question. So in the dummy coding, because of this coding, you've got a reference group, which is basically the usual content and the usual follow-on support. And the main effects are basically comparing those usual group to the enhanced usual in each case. And those are the comparisons that you're making when you're doing a dummy coding. In terms of the effect coding, the reference is either the usual content for the case where you're actually interested in the content component, or it's the usual follow-on if you're interested in that particular one. And then the main effects are basically enhanced versus usual for each component of your intervention. And it's much more straightforward. The bit that makes it slightly less straightforward, before you all go away and do it, is that actually if you code them -1 and +1, you will end up with half the effect for each of the main effects, and you will end up with a quarter of the effect for the interaction. But if you were to just replace that -1 in your analysis with a -1/2, and that +1 with a +1/2, and have it in as a continuous variable, it will provide you with exactly what you would have wanted directly without you having to do it afterwards in terms of that. So, now fully convinced myself, I hope you're sort of slightly convinced that this isn't necessarily the wrong thing to do, but you can think about it and then come back to me. We have managed to get a more advanced factorial design funded within HS&DR. And the idea with this particular one is to pick apart the feedback of audit and feedback even further and have 6 modifications to the feedback, and we're now in the process of deciding it. So one of the considerations we had here was thinking in terms of which of our modifications should we choose. So we had a variety of different things on offer, and there was a discussion that had in terms of trying to find the ones that we felt we were interested in testing, but also we felt might have an effect in terms of their own. And in terms of that, you've got the comparator in terms of the feedback, providing the feedback in more than one way, providing specific actions, progressive disclosure of the information, having a patient voice, and avoiding extraneous cognitive load. So we're interested in the individual effects of changing each of those things within the feedback report. And we had an option, one of the things that we needed was that you could change each of these interventions independently of one another, that changing one doesn't necessarily mean you have to change another. And we also needed that the off situation where you had none of the interventions there was still a reasonable intervention. But once we'd decided that, and we've got to that stage, the next stage in our thinking was to decide between what type of fractional factorial design, because the full factorial design would have meant 64 different interventions, which we felt was possibly unnecessary, mainly for various reasons I can go into another time. But as a result of that, we wanted to know whether to do 16 versions of it or 32 versions of our intervention. And we decided to do a half fraction because it meant that we had to make fewer assumptions about our interactions that we knew relatively little about, and because we felt that that was doable within the resource that we had. And that basically puts these into the 32 different etceteras, and there are 2 versions of this, and we've decided to do just the one. And you basically have them in the red, they're in the off version, and if they're black, they're in the on version of each of those. And you have all of those different combinations, and they allow you to estimate everything that we want to estimate. So, in terms of this, there is an argument, and I think it's not a bad argument, that you probably aren't talking about tiny trials if you're doing a factorial design of this sort. The reason why I don't think you are is that you've gone from trying to find the minimally important difference of a complete package compared to no package to trying to work out the effect of a component of an intervention, which is necessarily going to be a smaller effect because it's only part of the intervention effect, it's not all of it. So I think you're likely to be wanting to estimate relatively small effects. And I think that's the only reason why your factorial design will be a relatively large trial. It's not because of the possibility of finding an interaction, it's because you are looking for small effects, because they're interesting. And we decided at this stage that we were interested in main effects that were of about 0.3 standard deviations, and that allowed us to do everything within a sample size of 500. It would, by the way, and all that, have been 500 had I had 6 modifications or 60 modifications. We decided to do 6 modifications because we felt it was doable within the trial and it was a reasonable step up. We had a choice of about sort of 15 to 20 modifications that we were choosing between. We could have done a trial of all of them, but we felt that it was, in terms of implementing, too complicated. So the next stage, as I say, was choosing the 6 modifications. We then had to choose our half fraction, and we decided that, and there are a variety of ways that we went around doing that. Here we're drawing almost exclusively on the design of experiments literature, because that's where there is a lot of work on this, whereas there are the odd paper in the around the most design that I talked about at the beginning that tell you a bit about all of this. The next side of it was thinking in terms of the fractional factorial design. So what we're doing by having a fraction of the design as opposed to the entire full factorial design is we are summing up on one level. We're assuming that some of the interactions are 0, some of the higher order interactions. So the 6-way interaction between all of them we're assuming is 0. And by doing that, we are able to have simpler design in terms of implementation. And so there is a way that you have to decide that, and we decided to confound the 6-way interaction, but you could have decided to confound other ones if you were able to do that. The next part of it was deciding how to randomise. So we used stratified lists, and that meant that we needed to have a minimum block size of 32, which as a clinical trialist feels rather large. I would like to have more balance and more control over what I've got, given that I'm recruiting people in an ongoing basis than that. And therefore we decided to confound two of our interactions so that we could reduce down that block size to 16. And so it's done in that way whereby it is balanced within a block of 16 rather than within 32. We also stratified by the audit. We're able to do that reasonably easily. I would probably not try and stratify by too many things, because I think it becomes more complicated in a factorial design to stratify by a lot of things than it is in a parallel group design. In terms of the analysis, we would be handling missing data in the way that you would normally do within a clinical trial. We're using multiple imputation. We're definitely using our effect coding because we're interested in our main effects. We probably will only estimate the main effects and the 2-way interactions in the primary model because we think those are the ones where we're likely to find something, and because it simplifies the analysis. However, we will also include a test for lack of fit, which will allow us in an omnibus way to work out whether there are any 3-order or 4-order, 4-way or 5-way interactions that were important that we missed in our main analysis, and that allows us to do that in a fairly simple way. And if we were to find that there is a lack of fit, then we would go in and we would put in our 3-way interactions and our 4-way interactions, etc., and work those through. So I think that we're moving on, and I think that the field who have read about most designs are moving on. What I'm slightly worried about is that I don't think with papers such as Brendan Kahn's coming out in fairly high impact journals, and papers like that coming out on a regular basis, that we will carry on being able to do these sorts of trials. So I would quite like, I think, to write a reply that puts in much more eloquently than I've managed today the arguments as to why actually you're estimating something different, and therefore you shouldn't necessarily be expecting to be able to estimate it with a different way of estimating it, if you see what I mean. If you're estimating the wrong thing, of course it's biased. So you need to be careful about what you're estimating, and you need to therefore worry less about interactions. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Does anybody have any questions for Andy?
I find this really interesting actually, and I just wondered to what extent, but in terms of what you're estimating, you could go back, I don't know whether these terms are still in use because I'm a bit out of date on this, but there used to be a theory about orthogonal contrasts, which used to be quite useful in describing what it was you were estimating and making sure it wasn't affected by anything else.
Yes.
I did wonder if there isn't actually an interaction, or one of the assumptions that you're making about there being no interaction is true, then I think I would agree with you that the marginal way taking all the rows together is obviously the thing to go for.
Yes.
I did wonder if there were interactions, however, whether there was some other contrast which was somehow based on some weighting of the circumstances in actual practice, which was probably more relevant, rather than quoting what amounts to a main effect in the presence of interactions, which then is a slightly odd thing to do.
I think that a main effect in the presence of interactions is reasonable if what you're doing is trying to understand whether a component is important or not. You would then want to do a further trial where you would include that interaction as part of the design and have it estimated on top of that. And I don't think we've got, within the field, we haven't got to that sort of trial yet. So at the moment, we're really just trying to identify components rather than refine our intervention beyond that, if that makes any sense. Whereas I think that there's a fundamental difference between if I'm in the world of doing 2 trials for the price of 1, then I'm interested in those simple effects.
Yeah.
And I probably do want to separate out the interaction from my marginal effect so that I can estimate my simple effect as it should be, as opposed to estimating the marginal effect when I'm trying to estimate the simple effect, if that makes sense. So I think I do want to put my interaction in the model so that I can estimate my simple effect, and then I probably am slightly worried about the presence of an interaction because simple effects on their own aren't very helpful. Whereas I think main effects on their own probably are still helpful, if that makes any sense. Any other question? Yeah.
Yeah, so with the approach that you're proposing, so you're primarily interested in main effects, the marginal effects. If you find a main effect, do you then become interested in simple effects as well as like a secondary analysis or something, or do you just completely...
I'm not sure I am. I'm interested in the interaction effects at that stage. So I would be interested to know if I had 2 factors out of my 6 that are coming out as important, then I would be interested to know whether they interact with anything. And I would probably include in my next trial anything that interacts, or if I find any significant interactions, I would include any of those components, but I would also include those that were significant as main effects.
Thanks very much, Becky. That was fascinating. I'm thinking about interactions, and I suppose thinking about interactions in the widest possible way. And looking at Chalmers' paper there from 1955, acute infectious hepatitis. And obviously at that time we didn't really have a very good understanding of infectious hepatitis as we do now with advances in virology and so on. And I'm guessing, because I haven't read the paper, diet and rest were the 2 interventions that were applied.
Yes.
It just kind of stands to reason that there would be an interaction there, because if I don't rest, if I exercise more, I'm going to need to eat more, and therefore it's going to affect my diet. And I was sitting here trying to think of 2 potential interventions for any of the kind of, I suppose, long-term conditions that we might need to treat nowadays. And it's very difficult to separate out any effect. So I'm thinking of treatments of blood pressure, or non-pharmacological treatments of blood pressure. You might say, well, dietary interventions and exercise interventions. But again, there's going to be some form of interaction there, just at a very simple biological level.
So you would argue against the notion of doing 2 trials for the price of 1 at all?
No, I'm not saying that. I'm just thinking that it's trying to dissect out what the interaction. I'm guessing the interaction is at lots of different levels. I mean, simply if you're measuring
It's a statistical interaction from my point of view.
Yeah.
So it's
yeah.
not a biological interaction. I'm not. It may interact biologically, but the effects of each of the components might be additive. If they're additive, then there's no interaction. If they're not additive, then there is an interaction.
And there's no crossover between the biological and the statistical interaction, is it?
From my point of view, I don't mind. It's all about the statistical interaction.
Mm-hmm.